Since a presidential pardon saw him get an early release from prison, Todd Chrisley has been sharing his story about his time behind bars. In one recent share, the Chrisley Knows best star revealed an emotional moment concerning him and other inmates. Todd Chrisley and his family previously became known to audiences through the USA Network series Chrisley Knows Best. In 2022, however, Todd and his wife Julie were convicted of a variety of charges, including tax evasion and bank fraud. The two were initially sentenced to spend a combined 19 years behind bars. However, the two saw an early release this past May thanks to a presidential pardon from President Donald Trump. Since their release, Todd and Julie have been sharing their story with various outlets. The couple recently appeared on their daughter Savannah's Unlocked podcast. During a recent episode, Todd talked about what it was like during his time leaving prison. With Savannah noting he gave away a lot of his stuff, Todd reportedly left with only a small notebook on him. When staff asked Todd about the notebook, he reportedly shared that it contained all the notes I'm going to use to tell on y'all when I get out. And it's under my legal name. Todd then shared the send-off when he left. He shared, all the men had lined up. Savannah commented that she had seen this when she drove up. Todd shared, they all lined up in the lobby, and they started chanting when I walked out. And I started crying. And they said, don't leave us behind. It was at this point that Todd emphasized a promise he made. And I'm not going to leave those guys behind because I know how they have been abused from the case managers, from the counselors, not doing what they're supposed to be doing. As previously reported, this was a promise that Todd has made previously in the time since his release. He even shared stories about the men he met and his desire to help them at a press release just a few days following his original release. On social media, fans have also been sharing their own reactions to Todd's words. Many had hoped that with his name, he could make a difference. A few even emphasized that Todd was making something positive out of his time in prison. Some comments included, have you been following this story? Did you listen to Todd speak during Savannah's recent podcast? Make sure you come back to TV shows Ace for all the latest reality TV and celebrity news. Todd Chrisley had always been the picture of controlled elegance, polished, poised, and sharp-tongued. His life, once filmed under the bright lights of reality TV, was a daily performance of perfection. The Southern patriarch of Chrisley Knows best built his brand on appearances, manicured lawns, designer wardrobes, and the unwavering image of success. But reality has a strange way of finding everyone, no matter how carefully they build their walls. When Chrisley was sentenced to federal prison on charges of tax evasion and bank fraud, many assumed he would crumble. Instead, at first, he'd adjusted with an almost chilling calm, clinging to the same polished persona that had served him so well in the world outside. He remained composed, gracious even, leaning into his faith and discipline. The world waited to see him break, but for months, he wasn't the drab uniforms, the loss of luxury, or even the harsh routine of prison life that finally undid him. It was something far more profound, the humanity of the people around him. The image begins to crack. The first few weeks inside Pensacola FCI were quiet. Chrisley kept his head down. He exercised, read scripture, and stayed as detached as possible. Rumors swirled among inmates. Some resented his fame. Others were curious. But prison has its own ecosystem, and eventually, even reality stars must fall in line. He didn't try to act better than anyone, which earned him a grudging respect. Still, he remained emotionally guarded, smiling politely, nodding when spoken to, but never inviting connection. After all, what could a celebrity businessman and reality TV icon possibly have in common with men who had been hardened by years inside the system? He assumed he had nothing to learn from them. It started with something small. One evening, while folding laundry, a fellow inmate named Miguel offered him a piece of chocolate, an item bartered for in the underground economy of prison like it was gold. Chrisley declined politely. "You sure, man?" Miguel asked. "You look like you've had a rough day." Chrisley hesitated. he accepted. That piece of chocolate, bitter and slightly melted from Mado's pocket, was the first act of unguarded kindness he'd experienced since entering prison. It was an unexpected moment of gentleness, completely devoid of performance or obligation. The walls around Chrisley didn't collapse then, but a hairline crack began to form the stories behind the faces. He began to notice things. The man who washed dishes every morning with quiet diligence wasn't just another inmate. He was a former school teacher who'd gotten tangled in the opioid crisis. The gruff man who rarely spoke and lifted weights alone had once been a firefighter who lost everything after a tragic mistake. Miguel, the chocolate giver, had been a father of 4, working 3 jobs before he'd made a desperate decision that led him here. They all had stories. Some heartbreaking, some enraging, some redemptive. Chrisley started listening. Really listening. And in those quiet conversations, away from cameras and audiences, something unfamiliar stirred in him. He began to feel. Not for himself, but for others. He didn't speak about his own pain, how deeply he missed his children, how lost he sometimes felt at night when the lights went out and he lay alone with his thoughts. But the act of bearing witness to other people's stories began to chip away at the polished armor he'd worn all his life. The day of the breakdown was a Tuesday afternoon. The heat outside had thickened the air, and tempers were short. Chrisley was in the library, organizing a donation of books, when a new inmate arrived. He was young, no older than 21, thin, with wide, frightened eyes and a tremble in his voice. A few other inmates started teasing him, light-hearted at first, but slowly growing cruel. Chrisley watched from across the room, frozen. He'd seen bullying before, in all its forms, but something about this moment unsettled him. Chrisley, without knowing why, walked over and sat down next to him. He didn't speak. He just sat. Eventually, the young man calmed. Later that evening, in the dim light of the chapel, Chrisley sat alone on the bench where he often read. Miguel entered quietly and sat beside him. To cry. Not delicate tears. Not the kind of tearful confessional reserved for TV ratings. These were full, body-shaking sobs, the kind that had waited years to come out. The years of pretending, the fear of failure, the pressure to be perfect, the shame, the guilt, the weight of decisions made and opportunities lost. The realization that for so long he had measured worth by image, not by empathy. He cried for his children, for his wife, for the people he had let down, and also for the people who had shown him more compassion in prison than many ever had in the outside world. Miguel didn't say anything else. He just sat there, letting Chrisley break. A different kind of strength the next day. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Chrisley returned to his routine, but there was a lightness in his step. He smiled more. He spoke to the janitor who cleaned the hallways. He asked other inmates about their families. He shared books and encouraged others to join the GED program. Fundamentally shifted. He stopped pretending he had nothing to learn. And slowly, over time, he started to become someone new. Not a TV personality, not a disgraced businessman, but a man learning the deep, hard lessons of humility, connection, and redemption. A different kind of redemption. Todd Chrisley may never fully escape the legacy of his crimes, nor should he. Accountability is part of redemption, but what he found behind those locked doors was something no amount of money, fame, or applause could give him. He found his humanity, and he found it not in solitude, but in community among men who had been cast aside, judged, and forgotten. Men who offered him chocolate, shared their stories, protected the vulnerable, and sat beside him when he cried. He found it in the absence of image, in the raw truth of shared suffering and small kindnesses. And that truth, unfilmed, unscripted, unfiltered, is perhaps the most important thing Todd Chrisley has ever known. Todd Chrisley had spent years crafting the image of the perfect Southern gentleman. On television, he was charismatic, clean-cut, witty to the point of razor-sharp, and always in control. His family sat around him like well-placed decor in a show home, all smiles and designer wardrobes. America watched, laughed, and sometimes cringed as the Chrisley family navigated their lives under the glossy lens of reality TV. But the bright lights eventually dimmed. The lavish lifestyle turned out to be built on a foundation of lies. When Todd Chrisley was convicted of financial crimes and sentenced to federal prison, it seemed like poetic justice to some. To others, it was a tragedy. But behind the steel bars and institutional routines, away from the public gaze, something no one expected unfolded. Todd Chrisley, master of appearances, orchestrator of image, was brought to tears, and not by the system, not by regret alone, but by the unlikely kindness of fellow inmates who saw past his public persona and reached something far deeper.